The iron gates groaned open like the mouth of some ancient beast, exhaling the stench of sweat, blood, and fear into the morning air. Beneath the Colosseum's towering arches, shadows danced across stone worn smooth by countless footsteps and victorious, most final. In the underground chambers, men who had once been farmers, soldiers, and free citizens now sat chained to walls slick with moisture and despair. Their bodies bore the scars of training that was less education than torture. Welts from wooden swords that struck without mercy. Burns from brands that marked them as property. Eyes that had learned to see death not as an enemy, but as the only friend who might grant them peace. Above their heads, 50,000 Romans settled into marble seats, clutching wine and honey cakes, eager for the day's entertainment. But these weren't entertainers waiting in the darkness below. They were the walking dead, men whose lives had been stripped away so completely that dying well had become their only remaining dignity. The roar of the crowd wasn't applause, it was the sound of an empire feeding on human misery, turning desperation into spectacle, and transforming the arena into a machine that devoured souls. Today, we're descending into the true heart of gladiatorial combat, beyond the Hollywood myths and romantic legends. We're uncovering how Rome created a system so brutal that death became a mercy, and how men fought not for glory, but for the slim hope that their final moments might mean something. Before we step into this shadow, hit subscribe to Scandalous Past so you don't miss our next journey into history's darkest corners. Now, let the games begin. The making of the Damned. The path to the arena rarely began with choice. It started with catastrophe, wars lost, debts unpaid, crimes committed, or simply the misfortune of being born into slavery. Rome's gladiatorial schools, the Ludi, weren't training academies but factories for producing human weapons, each one designed to break a man's spirit before rebuilding him as an instrument of death. The largest and most infamous was the Ludus Magnus, connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel that allowed gladiators to be herded directly into the arena like cattle to slaughter. Within its walls, trainers called doctors wielded authority absolute as gods. They decided who ate, who slept, who lived, and who died during the brutal preparation that transformed ordinary men into killers. Training began before dawn and ended after dusk. Wooden swords, weighted with lead to build strength, crashed against shields until arms screamed in agony. Men practiced killing strokes on wooden posts called paulus until their hands bled through leather wrappings. The doctors watched with cold eyes, noting which recruits showed promise and which would serve better as practice targets for their betters. Food was rationed like medicine, enough to build muscle, never enough to satisfy hunger. Barley porridge, beans, and occasional scraps of meat kept bodies functional but spirits broken. Water was earned through performance, and failure meant thirst that burned worse than any wound. Sleep came on straw mattresses crawling with vermin, in cells barely large enough for a man to lie down. The psychological conditioning was perhaps more brutal than the physical. New arrivals were forced to watch veterans train, seeing the scars that mapped out years of survival. They learned the gladiator's oath, Uri, Vinciri, Verberari, Feroce Necari, to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. Speaking these words wasn't just ceremony, it was the legal surrender of their humanity. Some broke immediately. Guards would find them hanging from cell bars, having chosen death over the slow destruction of their souls. Others lasted weeks or months before madness claimed them. But a few, the ones who would become legends, found something harder and more terrible than despair. They found purpose in their own destruction. Veterans taught newcomers the unwritten rules of survival. Never show mercy unless the crowd demands it. Never trust a friend completely, because tomorrow you might face him across the sand. Never hope for freedom, because hope was a luxury that could get you killed. And most importantly, never forget that your life belonged to Rome now, to be spent for the entertainment of citizens who saw you as less than human. The trainers weren't just teaching combat techniques, they were creating a new species of man. One who could smile while planning murder, who could form friendships knowing they might be temporary, who could face death with such calm that spectators would gasp in admiration. They were manufacturing heroes from the raw material of human suffering. But even in this hell, hierarchies emerged. Gladiators were classified by fighting style and skill level. The retiarius fought with net and trident, quick and agile. The secutor pursued with sword and shield, relentless and heavily armored. The murmillo bore the equipment of a legionnaire, representing Rome's military might. Each style had its strengths, its weaknesses, and its devoted followers among the crowd. The most skilled fighters earned privileges, better food, private cells, even the right to keep a portion of prize money. But these rewards came with a price, the expectation of spectacular performance. A veteran gladiator wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting to maintain his status, his small comforts, his identity as something more than fodder for the arena. And always, hanging over everything like a sword suspended by a thread, was the knowledge that even the greatest champions eventually fell. Spartacus himself, the most famous gladiator in history, had once been just another slave learning to die for Rome's amusement. His rebellion would shake the empire to its foundations, but it began in the same cells, with the same despair, that consumed thousands of others who never found the strength to resist. The ludi weren't just schools, they were laboratories where Rome experimented with the limits of human endurance. How much could a man suffer before he broke? How completely could his identity be erased and rebuilt? How spectacular could his death be made? The answers to these questions would echo through the tunnels beneath every amphitheater in the empire, whispered by ghosts who had learned them the hard way. Blood and brotherhood in the shadow of death within the stone walls of the gladiatorial schools, something unexpected flourished alongside the brutality, bonds forged in shared suffering that ran deeper than blood. These weren't friendships in any normal sense, they were alliances between the damned, partnerships built on the understanding that today's training partner might be tomorrow's executioner. The gladiators developed their own language, a mixture of Latin, Greek, and the tongues of conquered peoples, peppered with slang that only they understood. They spoke of missio, the rare mercy that spared a defeated fighter's life. They whispered about rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom, a prize so rare that most gladiators died before ever seeing one. They shared stories of the summa rudis, the referee who decided their fates with a gesture, and the editor, the sponsor of the games, who held the power of life and death. Veterans took on younger fighters as alumni, not out of kindness but out of necessity. Survival in the arena required more than individual skill, it demanded understanding the crowd, reading the subtle signals that meant life or death, knowing how to fall in a way that might earn mercy. These lessons couldn't be learned from trainers, they had to be passed down from one generation of the doomed to the next. The relationships were complex and contradictory. Men who shared their meager rations and tended each other's wounds in the evening might face each other with drawn swords the next day. They developed rituals to cope with this impossible reality. Before matches, gladiators would often embrace, whispering prayers or final messages to be carried to the afterlife. Some made pacts: if one fell, the other would ensure his body received proper burial rites. Religion became a refuge and a weapon. Many gladiators adopted the worship of Nemesis, goddess of revenge and divine retribution, believing she would balance the scales of their suffering. Others turned to Mithras, the soldier's god, whose mysteries promised salvation through trial by ordeal. Some clung to the gods of their homelands: Germanic warriors praying to Wotan, Gallic fighters invoking Teutates, Thracians calling upon their ancient spirits. But perhaps most poignant were the gladiators who created their own mythology. They told stories of fighters who had transcended death itself, whose spirits haunted the arena to guide their successors. They spoke of secret techniques passed down through generations, of blessed weapons that could grant a clean death, of omens that could predict the outcome of matches. These weren't just superstitions, they were attempts to find meaning in meaninglessness, to create purpose from purposelessness. The gladiators also developed their own code of honor, unwritten but absolute. A fighter who showed cowardice would be shunned by his fellows, left to face his fate alone. But one who fought bravely, even in defeat, would be remembered in the songs they sang in their cells at night. They created their own aristocracy based not on birth or wealth, but on courage and skill in the face of certain death. Some gladiators formed collegia, burial societies that pooled their meager resources to ensure proper funeral rites for their members. These organizations were part insurance policy, part religious brotherhood, part resistance movement. They gave men who owned nothing the dignity of knowing their deaths would be mourned, their names remembered, their spirits honored according to ancient traditions. The most successful gladiators achieved a status that transcended their slavery. Champions like Flamma, who fought 34 times and won 31, became celebrities whose names were scratched into walls across the empire. Women threw flowers and jewelry into the arena, hoping to catch their attention. Merchants sold miniature figurines of famous fighters. Poets composed verses celebrating their victories. But this fame was a double-edged sword. Popular gladiators were valuable property, too precious to risk in routine matches. They fought less frequently but faced increasingly exotic and dangerous opponents, wild animals, multiple adversaries, or elaborate staged combats that tested their skills to the limit. Success bred its own form of suffering, as champions found themselves isolated even from their fellow gladiators, living in a strange limbo between slavery and stardom. The bonds between gladiators were tested most severely when they faced each other in the arena. Historical records speak of matches where fighters refused to engage, standing motionless until the crowd's fury forced them to fight. Others tell of gladiators who deliberately fought poorly, hoping to die together rather than kill a friend. These acts of defiance were rare but powerful, moments when human connection proved stronger than imperial control. Yet for every story of loyalty, there were others of betrayal. Gladiators who informed on escape attempts, who poisoned rivals, who used their knowledge of opponents' weaknesses to gain advantage in the arena. The pressure to survive corrupted even the strongest bonds, turning brothers in arms into enemies, protectors into predators. The gladiatorial schools became microcosms of the empire itself, places where different cultures, languages, and traditions collided and merged. A Gallic warrior might learn fighting techniques from a Germanic tribesman, while a Thracian taught both of them the religious mysteries of his homeland. In their shared suffering, these men created something Newa culture of the condemned that transcended the boundaries Rome had tried to impose. The economics of human misery behind the spectacle of gladiatorial combat lay, a vast economic machine that transformed human suffering into profit with ruthless efficiency. The gladiatorial industry wasn't just entertainment, it was one of Rome's most lucrative businesses, generating wealth for everyone except the men who bled for it. At the apex of this pyramid sat the Lanisti, the gladiator trainers and dealers who owned the schools and rented out fighters for games. These men wielded enormous influence, commanding prices that could bankrupt lesser nobles. A top-tier gladiator might cost as much as a luxury villa, while even novice fighters commanded fees equivalent to a skilled craftsman's annual wages. The most successful Lanisti accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of senators, building their wealth on a foundation of human bones. The investment required to maintain a gladiatorial school was staggering. Beyond the initial cost of purchasing slaves, owners had to pay for trainers, weapons, armor, medical care, food, and facilities. A single gladiator represented years of investment before he ever set foot in an arena. This economic reality shaped every aspect of their treatment. They were valuable property that needed to be maintained in fighting condition, but not so valuable that their owners couldn't afford to lose them. The gladiators themselves existed in a strange economic limbo. Technically slaves, they could nonetheless earn prize money for victories. Successful fighters accumulated peculium, personal funds that remained technically owned by their masters but could be used to purchase better equipment, food, or small luxuries. Some gladiators saved enough to eventually buy their freedom, though this was extraordinarily rare. Most prize money went toward basic survival, bribing guards for better treatment, purchasing medicine for injuries, or buying information about upcoming opponents. The betting industry that surrounded gladiatorial games dwarfed even the direct costs of staging them. Romans wagered enormous sums on individual matches, creating a secondary economy of bookmakers, tipsters, and fixers. Wealthy citizens might bet the equivalent of entire estates on a single fight, while common people wagered their daily bread. The potential for manipulation was enormous, and corruption flourished in the shadows of the amphitheaters. Some gladiators became unwitting participants in elaborate betting schemes. Matches could be fixed through drugged food, damaged equipment, or threats against a fighter's family. The most valuable gladiators were sometimes deliberately matched against inferior opponents to ensure victory for heavy bettors, while promising newcomers might face impossible odds to generate long-shot payouts. The line between sport and fraud was often invisible. The medical industry that grew around gladiatorial combat was both sophisticated and ghoulish. Doctors who specialized in treating arena injuries commanded high fees and developed techniques that wouldn't be seen again until modern times. They learned to perform rapid amputations, treat massive blood loss, and repair wounds that would have been fatal in other circumstances. But their primary loyalty was to the economic value of their patients, not their well-being. The most skilled gladiator physicians, like Galen who served in Pergamon's arena, used their positions to advance medical knowledge. They dissected the bodies of dead fighters, studied the effects of different weapons, and experimented with new treatments. The arena became an inadvertent laboratory where the boundaries of medical science were pushed forward through systematic violence. The weapons and armor industry created specialized craftsmen who catered exclusively to gladiatorial combat. These artisans developed techniques for creating equipment that was both functional and visually spectacular. A gladiator's gear wasn't just protection, it was costume, designed to enhance the theatrical aspects of combat. The most elaborate sets could cost more than a small farm, featuring intricate metalwork, exotic materials, and decorative elements that caught the light dramatically. But the economics of gladiatorial combat extended far beyond the arena itself. Entire industries grew up around the spectacle's food vendors, souvenir makers, prostitutes, pickpockets, and countless others who fed off the crowds that gathered for the games. The amphitheaters became economic engines that drove commerce throughout the empire, creating jobs and generating tax revenue that helped fund Rome's military expansion. The gladiators themselves were acutely aware of their economic value, and some learned to manipulate it for their own benefit. Popular fighters could demand better treatment by threatening to perform poorly, knowing that disappointing the crowd would cost their owners money. Veterans taught newcomers how to make their fights more entertaining without necessarily increasing their danger, techniques for drawing out combat to build suspense, and ways to signal to the crowd that they deserved mercy. The most successful gladiators transcended their status as mere property to become brands unto themselves. Their names and likenesses were used to sell everything from oil lamps to jewelry. Merchants paid licensing fees to use their images, and some fighters received a percentage of these profits. In a society where slaves owned nothing, a few gladiators managed to accumulate enough wealth to live like minor nobles, though always under the shadow of their next fight. Yet for all the money that flowed through the gladiatorial industry, the fighters themselves remained trapped in a system designed to extract maximum value from their suffering. They were simultaneously the most valuable and most expendable components of the machine, celebrated when they won and discarded when they lost. Their economic worth was measured not in years of life, but in moments of spectacular death. The ritual of dying well in the amphitheater, death wasn't simply an end, it was a performance, carefully choreographed and laden with meaning that extended far beyond the individual fighter. The Romans had transformed the act of dying into an art form, complete with its own aesthetics, traditions, and moral imperatives. For the gladiators, learning to die well became as important as learning to fight, because their final moments would determine how they were remembered and whether their deaths had any meaning at all. The concept of bona morte, good death, permeated Roman culture, but nowhere was it more crucial than in the arena. A gladiator who faced death with courage, dignity, and grace could achieve a form of immortality that transcended his status as a slave. The crowd didn't just want to see killing, they wanted to witness transcendence, to see ordinary men elevated to heroic status through the manner of their dying. The ritual began long before the fatal blow was struck. Defeated gladiators were expected to kneel and present their throats to their opponents, a gesture called ad gladium. This wasn't surrender in the conventional sense, it was the final assertion of their humanity. By choosing how to face death, they reclaimed a measure of control over their fate. The position itself was symbolic. Kneeling showed submission to the victor and the crowd, but maintaining an upright posture demonstrated that their spirit remained unbroken. The crowd played a crucial role in this death ritual. Their cheers or jeers could influence whether a defeated gladiator received missio mercy that spared his life. But the decision ultimately rested with the editor, the sponsor of the games, who would signal his choice with a gesture. The famous thumbs down of popular imagination was likely a later invention. Roman sources suggest the signal was more complex, possibly involving the direction the thumb pointed or whether it was concealed within the fist. For gladiators, the possibility of mercy was both hope and torment. It meant that every fight could potentially be survived, but it also meant that death, when it came, carried the additional sting of rejection. A gladiator who died had been judged unworthy of life by thousands of spectators. This psychological dimension added layers of suffering that went beyond physical pain. The actual moment of death was subject to strict protocols. The victor was expected to deliver a clean, quick kill, usually a thrust to the throat or heart. Prolonging the agony was considered poor form and could turn the crowd against the winner. The dying gladiator, for his part, was expected to meet death without crying out or begging for mercy. Silence in the face of death was the final test of courage. Some gladiators prepared for death through elaborate personal rituals. They might pray to their chosen gods, recite the names of their loved ones, or perform gestures specific to their homeland. Veterans often carried small tokens, pieces of jewelry, religious symbols, or letters from family that they would clutch in their final moments. These personal touches humanized the spectacle, reminding observers that the dying man had once been someone's son, father, or friend. The crowd's reaction to a gladiator's death revealed much about Roman values and psychology. They applauded courage and jeered cowardice, but their definitions of these qualities were complex and sometimes contradictory. A fighter who died bravely after a poor performance might receive more respect than a skilled warrior who showed fear. The Romans valued the performance of virtue as much as virtue itself. After death, the gladiator's body became part of the ritual. Attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, would test the corpse with a heated iron to ensure death was real. Others, costumed as Mercury, would escort the body from the arena. These theatrical elements transformed individual deaths into mythological events, connecting each gladiator's end to the larger stories that gave meaning to Roman life. The disposal of gladiator corpses was itself a complex process that reflected social hierarchies even in death. The most celebrated fighters might receive elaborate funeral rites, with their bodies burned on pyres and their ashes placed in marked graves. Lesser gladiators were often buried in mass graves outside the city, their names forgotten but their bones bearing witness to their sacrifice. Some gladiators achieved a form of resurrection through the crowd's memory. Their names would be chanted in future games, their fighting styles imitated by newcomers, their deaths recounted in taverns and bathhouses across the empire. The most legendary fighters transcended their mortality to become part of Roman mythology, their stories growing with each telling until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. The gladiators themselves developed their own beliefs about what awaited them after death. Some embraced traditional Roman concepts of the afterlife, hoping to join the shades in the underworld. Others clung to the religious traditions of their homelands, believing their courage in the arena would earn them a place in warriors' paradise. Many created syncretic beliefs that combined elements from different traditions, crafting personal mythologies that gave meaning to their suffering. The ritual of dying well served multiple functions in Roman society. For the gladiators, it offered the possibility of dignity in defeat and meaning in death. For the crowd, it provided moral instruction and emotional catharsis. For the empire, it demonstrated the power of Roman values to transform even slaves into heroes. But beneath all these layers of meaning lay a simpler truth: in a world where life was cheap, death was the only currency that retained its value. The women who fought in hell hidden in the shadows of gladiatorial history were the gladiatress women who stepped into the arena to face the same brutal fates as their male counterparts, but with the added burden of defying every expectation Roman society held about femininity, honor, and the proper place of women. Their stories have been largely erased from popular memory, dismissed as curiosities or aberrations, but the archaeological and literary evidence reveals a more complex truth: women fought and died in the arena, and their presence challenged the very foundations of Roman gender roles. The existence of female gladiators was controversial even in ancient Rome. Conservative writers like Juvenal mocked them as unnatural aberrations, describing wealthy women who abandoned their domestic duties to train with weapons. Tacitus recorded with disapproval that women of senatorial rank participated in gladiatorial games during Nero's reign, viewing their involvement as a symptom of moral decay. Yet these same sources confirm what they sought to condemn: women were fighting in the arena, and their performances were drawing crowds. The path to the arena was different for women than for men, but no less brutal. Some were slaves, captured in the same wars that fed the male gladiatorial schools. Others were criminals condemned to death, their sentences commuted to service in the arena. But perhaps most shocking to Roman sensibilities were the volunteers-free women who chose to enter gladiatorial training, surrendering their legal rights and social status for reasons that remain mysterious. The motivations of these volunteers have puzzled historians for centuries. Some may have been driven by desperate poverty, seeing the arena as their only chance for survival. Others might have been attracted by the possibility of fame and fortune that successful gladiators could achieve. A few may have been motivated by genuine bloodlust or a desire to prove themselves in combat. But for many, the choice to become a gladiatrix may have been the only way to escape even worse fates: abusive marriages, crushing debts, or lives of grinding servitude. The training of female gladiators followed many of the same brutal patterns as their male counterparts, but with additional complications. Roman society had no framework for understanding women as warriors, so the gladiatrices existed in a legal and social limbo. They were neither proper women nor proper gladiators, but something new and disturbing that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and power. Archaeological evidence from Halicarnassus reveals the tomb of two female gladiators, Amazon and Achillea, who fought each other to a draw and were both granted mission extraordinarily rare outcome that suggests their combat was particularly spectacular. The relief sculpture on their tomb shows them equipped with the same professional gear as male gladiators, indicating that they were serious fighters, not mere novelties. The weapons and fighting styles of gladiatrices varied, but they seem to have favored lighter equipment that emphasized speed and agility over brute strength. Some fought as retiarii, using nets and tridents, while others adopted the gear of provocatrices, with rectangular shields and straight swords. The choice of equipment wasn't just practical, it was symbolic, representing different aspects of femininity transformed into instruments of war. The crowd's reaction to female gladiators was complex and contradictory. Some spectators were titillated by the spectacle of women in combat, viewing it as an exotic entertainment that combined violence with sexual display. Others were genuinely impressed by the skill and courage of the fighters, according them the same respect given to male champions. But many Romans found the sight of armed women deeply disturbing, a violation of natural order that threatened the stability of society itself. The gladiatrices faced unique challenges beyond the physical dangers of combat. They had to navigate the complex politics of the arena while dealing with the additional scrutiny that came with their gender. Male gladiators who showed mercy or emotion might be criticized, but they remained within acceptable bounds of masculine behavior. Female gladiators who displayed the same qualities risked being dismissed as weak or unnatural. Some gladiatrices achieved considerable fame and success. Graffiti from Pompeii mentions female fighters by name, suggesting they had devoted followings. Literary sources describe wealthy women attending gladiatorial schools to learn combat techniques, though whether they actually fought in public games remains unclear. The line between training and performance, between sport and spectacle, was often blurred when it came to female participants. The sexual dimension of female gladiatorial combat cannot be ignored. Roman society was deeply concerned with the sexual purity of women, and the arena was seen as a place of moral corruption. Gladiatrices were automatically assumed to be sexually available, their participation in combat marking them as beyond the bounds of respectable femininity. This assumption added another layer of exploitation to their already brutal existence. Yet some gladiatrices seem to have found ways to maintain their dignity and agency even within this oppressive system. The tomb inscription of Amazon and Achillea describes them as having fought honorably and been granted their freedom together, a partnership that may have transcended the usual boundaries between competitors. Their story suggests that even in the arena's hell, human connections could survive and flourish. The religious lives of gladiatrices were particularly complex. Traditional Roman religion offered few models for warrior women, forcing them to seek divine protection from foreign goddesses or create new forms of worship. Some may have turned to Diana, the huntress goddess, while others might have embraced the mystery cults that promised salvation regardless of gender or social status. The end of female gladiatorial combat came gradually, as changing social attitudes and the rise of Christianity made the spectacle increasingly unacceptable. By the late imperial period, women were banned from participating in gladiatorial games, though they continued to appear in beast hunts and other arena spectacles. The gladiatrices faded from history, their stories buried beneath centuries of silence and shame. But their legacy endures in the questions they raised about gender, power, and the nature of courage itself. In a society that defined women primarily through their relationships to men, the gladiatrices claimed the right to define themselves through their own actions, even if those actions led to death. They proved that the capacity for both violence and heroism transcended gender, challenging assumptions that would persist for centuries after the last arena fell silent. The rebellion that shook an empire in 73 BC, the most famous gladiator in history, shattered his chains and ignited a rebellion that would expose the fundamental contradictions at the heart of Roman civilization. Spartacus wasn't just a slave who fought for freedom, he was a symbol of everything Rome feared about the men it had created in its arenas, warriors with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from the empire's destruction. The rebellion began in the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, where Spartacus trained alongside fighters from across the known world. The conditions that sparked the uprising weren't unique to this particular ludus, they were the inevitable result of a system that pushed human beings beyond the breaking point. Overcrowding, brutal training, inadequate food, and the constant threat of death had created a powder keg that needed only a spark to explode. Spartacus himself remains an enigma wrapped in legend. Ancient sources describe him as a Thracian warrior who had served in the Roman auxiliary forces before being enslaved, though the circumstances of his capture remain unclear. Some accounts suggest he was a deserter, others that he was captured in battle. What's certain is that he possessed the military knowledge and natural leadership that would transform a desperate escape attempt into a war that threatened Rome itself. The initial breakout involved only 78 gladiators who overpowered their guards and seized weapons from the school's armory. They could have simply fled into the countryside, disappearing into the anonymity of the slave population. Instead, they chose to fight, establishing a base on Mount Vesuvius and sending out calls for others to join their rebellion. The response was overwhelming. Slaves, gladiators, and free poor flocked to Spartacus's banner in numbers that shocked Roman authorities. What made Spartacus's rebellion different from previous slave uprisings was its military sophistication. The gladiator-turned-general understood Roman tactics and used that knowledge against his former masters. He organized his forces into disciplined units, established supply lines, and employed strategies that consistently outmaneuvered Roman legions. His army wasn't just a mob of angry slaves, it was a military force capable of defeating professional soldiers in open battle. The rebellion exposed the empire's dependence on slave labor and the inherent instability of a system built on oppression. As Spartacus's forces swept through southern Italy, they liberated thousands of slaves from plantations and mines. These weren't just gladiators seeking revenge, they were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who had been brutalized by Roman exploitation. Their willingness to risk everything for freedom revealed the depth of resentment that simmered beneath the empire's surface. The psychological impact of the rebellion was perhaps even more devastating than its military successes. Romans had convinced themselves that their slaves were content with their lot, that the gladiatorial games demonstrated the natural order of superior and inferior peoples. Spartacus shattered these comforting illusions, proving that the men Rome had trained to kill could turn their skills against their masters with devastating effect. The rebellion also revealed the complex dynamics within the gladiatorial community. Not all fighters joined Spartacus, some remained loyal to their masters, while others chose to wait and see how events unfolded. The bonds between gladiators, forged in shared suffering, proved both stronger and more fragile than anyone had expected. Brotherhood could transcend the boundaries of slavery, but it could also be torn apart by conflicting loyalties and competing visions of freedom. As the rebellion grew, it attracted followers from across the social spectrum. Dispossessed farmers, urban poor, and even some free citizens joined the cause, drawn by Spartacus's promise of a world without masters and slaves. The movement became something larger than a slave revolt. It was a challenge to the fundamental structures of Roman society, a vision of an alternative way of organizing human relationships. The Roman response was initially hampered by arrogance and miscalculation. Senators dismissed the rebellion as a minor disturbance that could be easily suppressed by local forces. When these proved inadequate, they sent larger armies, only to see them defeated by Spartacus's tactical brilliance. Each Roman defeat swelled the rebel ranks and demonstrated that the empire's military might wasn't invincible. The turning point came when Rome finally recognized the true scope of the threat and assigned Marcus Licinius Crassus to crush the rebellion. Crassus understood that he was fighting not just for military victory but for the survival of the Roman system itself. He employed brutal tactics, including the decimation of units that showed cowardice, and gradually wore down Spartacus's forces through a war of attrition. The end came in 71 BC, when Spartacus was killed in battle and his army was finally destroyed. But Crassus's victory was Pyrrhic in many ways. To prevent future rebellions, he ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, creating a forest of crosses that stretched for miles. The message was clear: this was the fate that awaited anyone who challenged Roman authority. Yet the rebellion's impact extended far beyond its military defeat. Spartacus had proven that slaves could organize, fight, and win against their oppressors. His example inspired future generations of rebels and revolutionaries, becoming a symbol of resistance that would outlive the empire that destroyed him. The Romans had created their own nemesis in the gladiatorial schools, training men to be warriors and then acting surprised when they turned those skills against their masters. The rebellion also changed how Romans viewed their gladiators. The games continued, but with increased security and surveillance. The bonds between fighters were monitored more closely, and any sign of organization was brutally suppressed. The arena became not just a place of entertainment but a laboratory for studying and controlling the psychology of the oppressed. In the end, Spartacus's rebellion revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Roman civilization. An empire built on conquest and slavery had created the instruments of its own potential destruction. Every gladiator trained was a potential enemy, every arena a possible recruiting ground for rebellion. The Romans had built their entertainment on a foundation of human misery, and Spartacus had shown them the price of that choice. The slow death of the games. The decline of gladiatorial combat wasn't a sudden collapse but a gradual erosion that reflected the changing values, economics, and politics of a dying empire. By the 4th century AD, the arena that had once symbolized Roman power and unity had become a relic of a bygone age, increasingly out of step with a world transformed by Christianity, economic crisis, and barbarian invasions. The rise of Christianity dealt the first serious blow to the gladiatorial tradition. Early Christian writers like Tertullian had condemned the games as manifestations of demonic influence, arguing that watching men kill each other for entertainment corrupted the soul and violated divine law. As Christianity gained influence in the imperial court, these moral arguments found increasingly receptive audiences among the ruling class. The conversion of Constantine in the early 4th century marked a turning point. While the emperor didn't immediately ban gladiatorial games, he began restricting them and promoting alternative forms of entertainment. Christian bishops used their growing influence to pressure local magistrates to abandon the games, arguing that a Christian empire couldn't continue to celebrate pagan rituals of blood and death. Economic factors also played a crucial role in the games' decline. The cost of staging elaborate gladiatorial spectacles had always been enormous, but by the late empire, the financial burden had become unsustainable. The empire's economy was crumbling under the weight of military expenses, barbarian invasions, and administrative corruption. Local magistrates could no longer afford to sponsor the lavish games that had once been essential for political advancement. The gladiatorial schools themselves were becoming economically unviable. The steady supply of prisoners of war that had once fed the arenas was drying up as Rome's military expansion came to an end. The empire was increasingly on the defensive, fighting to preserve its borders rather than expanding them. Without a constant influx of captives, the schools had to rely more heavily on volunteers and condemned criminals, both of which were less reliable sources of fighters. The quality of gladiatorial combat was also declining. The legendary fighters of earlier centuries had been replaced by less skilled performers who lacked the training and dedication of their predecessors. The elaborate fighting styles and sophisticated equipment that had once characterized the games gave way to cruder spectacles that failed to capture the public imagination. The arena was becoming a shadow of its former self. Social attitudes toward the games were changing as well. The Roman aristocracy, increasingly influenced by Christian values and philosophical traditions that emphasized mercy and compassion, began to view gladiatorial combat as barbaric and outdated. The intellectual climate of the late empire favored more refined forms of entertainment: chariot racing, theatrical performances, and religious festivals that didn't involve human sacrifice. The barbarian invasions of the 4th and 5th centuries delivered the final blow to the gladiatorial tradition. As Germanic tribes swept across the empire's frontiers, resources that might have been used for games were diverted to military defense. Many amphitheaters were converted into fortresses or abandoned altogether as cities struggled to survive in an increasingly chaotic world. The last recorded gladiatorial games took place in the early 5th century, though the exact date remains disputed. By this time, the spectacles had become pale imitations of their former glory: small-scale affairs that attracted little attention and generated even less enthusiasm. The great amphitheaters that had once hosted epic battles stood empty, their sand courts overgrown with weeds, their underground chambers silent. The end of the games marked more than just the conclusion of a form of entertainment, it represented the death of a worldview. The Roman belief in the value of spectacular violence, the notion that watching men die could serve moral and political purposes, had finally been rejected by the civilization that created it. The arena had been both the symbol and the instrument of Roman power, and its abandonment signaled the empire's transformation into something fundamentally different. Yet the legacy of the gladiatorial games didn't disappear entirely. The amphitheaters remained as monuments to a vanished world, their ruins serving as reminders of both Roman engineering prowess and Roman brutality. Medieval chroniclers preserved stories of the great gladiators, though these tales became increasingly mythologized over time. The memory of the arena lived on in literature, art, and popular culture, inspiring both admiration and revulsion in subsequent generations. The Christian Church, which had played such a crucial role in ending the games, paradoxically helped preserve their memory. Church fathers used the gladiators as examples of both human depravity and divine redemption, arguing that even the most degraded souls could find salvation through faith. The arena became a metaphor for the spiritual struggles that defined Christian life, with believers cast as gladiators fighting against sin and death. The end of gladiatorial combat also marked a shift in how societies thought about entertainment, violence, and the value of human life. The Roman willingness to sacrifice lives for amusement would be remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily civilization could slip into barbarity. Yet the fascination with the arena would persist, inspiring countless works of fiction and serving as a touchstone for discussions about the relationship between power, spectacle, and moral responsibility. In the ruins of the Colosseum and other amphitheaters, visitors could still feel the echoes of the crowds that had once filled those spaces. The stones themselves seemed to whisper the stories of the men and women who had died there, their blood long since washed away but their suffering somehow preserved in the very architecture of the buildings. The arena had become a tomb, a monument to the thousands who had perished for the entertainment of others. Echoes in stone and memory today, the Colosseum stands as one of the world's most recognizable monuments, its weathered arches and crumbling walls drawing millions of visitors who come to marvel at Roman engineering and imagine the spectacles that once unfolded on its sand-covered floor. But beneath the tourist attraction lies a darker truth. This is a monument to systematic brutality, a temple where human sacrifice was disguised as entertainment for nearly 4 centuries. Walking through the underground chambers where gladiators once waited for death, visitors can still see the mechanical systems that made the games possible. The elaborate network of tunnels, elevators, and trap doors that allowed men and beasts to appear suddenly in the arena, creating moments of surprise and terror for both fighters and spectators. These engineering marvels served a single purpose: to make killing more dramatic and death more spectacular. The archaeological evidence tells stories that the ancient sources often omitted or sanitized. Excavations have revealed the remains of gladiatorial schools, complete with training equipment, medical facilities, and burial grounds. The bones of fighters show evidence of repeated injuries, surgical interventions, and the kind of wear patterns that come from years of violent combat. These physical remains provide a more honest account of gladiatorial life than the romanticized versions found in literature and art. Modern scholars have worked to reconstruct the daily reality of gladiatorial existence, moving beyond the myths and legends to understand the human cost of Roman entertainment. They've analyzed dietary remains to understand how gladiators were fed, studied weapon fragments to reconstruct fighting techniques, and examined graffiti to glimpse the thoughts and feelings of the fighters themselves. This research has revealed a world of complexity and contradiction, where moments of genuine heroism coexisted with systematic dehumanization. The gladiatorial games have left their mark on language and culture in ways that persist to this day. The word arena comes from the Latin for sand, the material used to absorb blood on the amphitheater floor. Gladiator has become synonymous with any fighter who faces overwhelming odds. The phrase, thumbs down, carries the weight of Roman death sentences, even though historians debate whether Romans actually used this gesture. The arena's vocabulary has become part of our collective memory, carrying forward the echoes of ancient violence. In literature and film, gladiators have been repeatedly reimagined as symbols of resistance, heroism, and the triumph of the human spirit over oppression. From the novels of Howard Fast to the films of Ridley Scott, popular culture has transformed the arena from a place of imperial control into a stage for individual rebellion. These modern interpretations often say more about contemporary values than historical reality, but they demonstrate the enduring power of the gladiatorial story to inspire and disturb. The moral questions raised by the gladiatorial games remain relevant in an age of mass media and global entertainment. How different are modern combat sports from ancient arena contests? What does our fascination with violence in movies, video games, and television say about human nature? The Romans created a form of entertainment that combined athletic skill, dramatic narrative, and real death elements that continue to attract audiences in various forms today. Historians and ethicists continue to debate the lessons of the arena. Some see the gladiatorial games as evidence of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the dangers of unchecked power. Others view them as examples of how individuals can maintain dignity and meaning even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The gladiators themselves become symbols of both victimization and agency, men who were simultaneously powerless and powerful, slaves who achieved a form of immortality through their willingness to die well. The physical remains of the amphitheater serve as powerful reminders of the scale and scope of Roman entertainment. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 spectators, but it was just one of hundreds of similar structures scattered across the empire. From Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria, Roman cities built amphitheaters where local populations could participate in the imperial culture of violence. The games weren't just a Roman phenomenon, they were a tool of cultural imperialism that spread Roman values throughout the known world. Archaeological work continues to reveal new aspects of gladiatorial culture. Recent discoveries have included gladiator cemeteries with elaborate grave goods, suggesting that some fighters achieved considerable wealth and status. Inscriptions have been found that record the careers of individual gladiators, providing glimpses into their personalities and achievements. Medical instruments discovered at gladiatorial schools reveal the sophisticated healthcare that was available to valuable fighters, a stark contrast to the brutal conditions they faced in training and combat. The conservation of amphitheater sites has become a complex challenge that reflects changing attitudes toward this difficult heritage. How should societies preserve and present monuments to systematic violence? What stories should be told, and which voices should be heard? Museums and heritage sites struggle to balance historical accuracy with moral responsibility, seeking to educate visitors about the past without glorifying its brutality. The gladiatorial games also raise questions about memory and forgetting. For centuries after their end, the arena was remembered primarily through Christian sources that emphasized its cruelty and paganism. The Renaissance rediscovered classical sources that sometimes romanticize the games, while the modern era has seen attempts to understand them in their full complexity. Each generation has found different meanings in the arena, using the gladiators to explore contemporary concerns about violence, entertainment, and human nature. In the end, the legacy of the gladiatorial games is as complex and contradictory as the institution itself. The arena was simultaneously a place of horror and heroism, oppression and resistance, degradation and transcendence. The men and women who fought there were victims of a brutal system, but they were also agents who found ways to assert their humanity even in the face of death. Their stories continue to resonate because they speak to fundamental questions about courage, dignity, and the meaning of life itself. The stones of the Colosseum will continue to crumble, but the questions raised by the gladiatorial games will endure as long as humans struggle with the relationship between power and entertainment, violence and meaning, individual agency and systemic oppression. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting monument to the gladiators, not the ruins of their prison, but the ongoing conversation about what their lives and deaths mean for our understanding of ourselves and our societies. The sand has long since been swept away, the roar of the crowd silenced by centuries of wind and rain. But in the shadows of the Colosseum's arches, something lingers, the echo of men who faced the impossible choice between a life without dignity and a death with meaning. They chose death, not because they were heroes, but because death was the only freedom left to them. The gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment, they were a mirror reflecting the soul of an empire that had forgotten the difference between strength and cruelty, between power and brutality. Rome created a machine that devoured human lives and called it civilization, that turned suffering into spectacle and named it glory. The gladiators were both its products and its victims, men who learned to find honor in a system designed to strip them of their humanity. Their legacy isn't found in the myths and movies that have romanticized their struggles, but in the harder truth that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose how to face their fate. The gladiators remind us that dignity isn't something that can be taken away, it can only be surrendered. And in their final moments, kneeling in the sand with the crowd's judgment ringing in their ears, they proved that even slaves could die as free men. So what do you think? Which aspect of the gladiatorial system reveals the most about human nature? The brutality of the crowds who cheered for death, the resilience of the fighters who found meaning in meaninglessness, or the empire that built its entertainment on a foundation of human misery? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey into the dark heart of Roman entertainment has captivated you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for scandalous pasts. We're always uncovering the hidden truths behind history's most fascinating and disturbing stories. And remember, while our stories are inspired by real events and historical research, they are presented as dramatized narratives for entertainment purposes. The past is a foreign country, and we're just visitors trying to understand its strange and often terrible customs. Until next time, remember that the arena may be silent now, but its echoes still whisper through the stones, reminding us that the price of civilization is often paid in blood, and that sometimes, death truly was the gladiator's best hope.